Good afternoon. Good afternoon to everybody. Today I'm very pleased to introduce Sharon Batt. Sharon Batt is professor at the Department of Bioethics and Department of Political Science at the University of Halifax in Canada. She is a researcher, she is a writer. She is here within the Jean Monnet project, which is an European project that aims to organize some networking among centers with the aim to increase the awareness and the debate on specific topics. Sharon Batt is a writer also, and I would like to present you this book that is Health Advocacy, How Pharmaceutical Funding Changed the Breast Cancer Movement. She is going to present us her research activity in the field of patient groups and the influence of pharmaceutical funding. So Sharon, thank you to be here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Cynthia. And thank you all for coming here. I really appreciate it. And I'm so excited to be here. I've heard so much about the Institute, and it's just a model that I admire so much. Yeah, my niece is here with me. She told me she hoped I had some jokes in my talk, and I don't have any jokes, but maybe I'll think of a few as I'm speaking. So 3 years ago, I read the book Big Pharma by Donald Light and Antonio Maturo about the Mario Negri Institute, and I could hardly believe such a place existed, and that I didn't know about it up to that point. So I wrote an article about the book for the Hastings Center report that featured a review. And shortly afterwards, I met Professor Garatini at a workshop in Amsterdam, which was about controlling high drug prices. And my appetite to visit the Institute grew. So my research base, as Cynthia said, at Dalhousie is part of the Jean Monnet Network on Health Law and Policy. It's the program that sponsored my visit here today. So I thank both the Mario Negri Institute and the Monnet Network for making the visit possible. So one goal of the network, as Cynthia said, is to compare the European Union and Canada and to highlight important lessons that the two partners across the Atlantic can learn from one another. And I hope my talk today fulfills that purpose. So I'm a qualitative researcher, and my approach is to create a narrative based on interviews, documents, published literature. So I use that methodology to critically examine the logic that underlies the power that we now grant to patient advocates in contemporary medicine. The idea is that if we include patient voices in health research and decisions, you'll enhance both science and democratic ideals. And in my talk, it may seem like I'm jumping around a lot to different topics that may not seem obviously related, but my idea is that I hope to bring them all together by the end of the talk. So please bear with me and don't think I've lost my way. And if I'm speaking too quickly, please let me know and I'll slow down. So. Sorry. Okay. So the rationale of including patients in research and policy is based on these three assumptions. First, that patients have an embodied knowledge that comes from the experience of living with a particular condition, and this adds value to the research that's done in the lab. Second, patient engagement can enhance democracy because health policies directly affect patients, and this confers a democratic right for them to contribute to these policies. Third, including a patient's perspective can bring research more in line with patients' needs. And so this is a quote from Big Pharma about having a paradigm shift that will emphasize the patient. So a focus on the patient holds the promise of resolving a long-standing tension between medicine's ethical obligations to the consumer and the business of making profits and contributing to economic growth. But what happens if patients and the advocacy groups that represent them become entangled with the world of marketing and profits? This is a question at the heart of my research, and it has much in common with work that's being done here at the Institute on patient groups. So I'd like to recall the case of Luigi DiBella and his cancer therapy and how it played out in Canada, which has many Italian immigrants that have moved there over the years. In Good Pharma, Light and Maturo described the efforts of Professor Garatini to expose this treatment in Italy as fraudulent, efforts that evoked a lot of hostility from its believers. DiBella's treatment also aroused strong interest in the Italian community in Canada, where stories had appeared in the local Italian media. So a group of Italian-Canadian cancer patients and their families formed the Pro-DiBella Association and arranged to have Dr. DiBella visit Canada, where he was mobbed at the airport in Toronto on his arrival by hundreds of people. This was in June 1998. A member of Canada's Parliament, Joe Volpe, who was born in Italy, was parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Health at the time, and he led a group of 4 cancer specialists from Canada to Italy to meet with Dr. DiBella and with researchers conducting the clinical trials here. The 4 physicians concluded that no evidence supported the treatment, a conclusion that many patients in Canada, as here, refused to believe. So the DiBella story for me illustrates a phenomenon that I've called the logic of choice, the claim that desperate patients and patient advocacy groups that speak for them know what treatment is best for them, and that they have a right to choose it, even when these wishes go against the medical evidence, or if the evidence is lacking. I borrowed the phrase, the logic of choice, from the Dutch researcher and philosopher Anne-Marie Moll. And she juxtaposes this idea with another logic, the logic of care. And I'll return to the distinction that she's making later on. Just a bit about myself and how I got interested in these issues. The choice versus care distinction captures a conflict within the patient movement that I document in my research in Canada and that I was personally involved in. I first became interested in medicine back in 1988 as a newly diagnosed cancer patient. I was a journalist, but I didn't understand the world of medicine at all. I drew from my skills as a journalist to make sense of the confusing information about breast cancer treatment and research. And when I examined the controversies in breast cancer treatment and research, and there were many, I discovered something intriguing. In every case, the controversies included conflicts over how to balance commerce and the public good. I argued strongly for involving patients in health policy. I thought that patients living with life-threatening diseases like cancer had such a strong vested interest in good science that they would challenge the financial incentives that so often distort science on which medicine is based. I became active in the patient power movement of the 1990s, and I was fully engaged in the breast cancer movement in Canada and also internationally for 10 years. But after a decade, I was disturbed by the increasingly close relationship between patient activists and the pharmaceutical industry. I began to question whether the patient activist movement was serving either science or democracy. So we now have a proliferation of patient groups funded by pharmaceutical companies in Canada and elsewhere, which means that patient voices claiming to articulate what's best for the patient mingle with companies whose interests are what's best for marketing, patents, and profits. The existence of these alliances, let alone how they work, is often not transparent. I decided to study pharmaceutical company funding and the patient movement from the inside. How did these partnerships come about? What do they mean for the goals of better science and more democratic processes? To fully understand the pharma partnerships, I argue that we need to critically examine neoliberalism and how it has changed the global conversation in health. In broad strokes, the political climate in Western democracies since the end of the Second World War is characterized by two periods of intense policy activity with intervening periods of relative stability, and our present reality, which I would argue is another period of turmoil. So I was interested in how these broad currents could help us understand the shifts in health policies and pharmaceutical policies and the policies that shape nonprofit organizations. With regards to health and pharmaceuticals, in the three post-war decades, we saw the creation of the World Health Organization, the expansion of public systems of healthcare, and we saw drug development become a thriving industry with dramatic medical successes like the polio vaccine, but other drugs like thalidomide did enormous harm. The pro-regulatory governments of the post-war era took note of the strong warning of the thalidomide tragedy. They recognized that unforeseen drug toxicities, along with high prices, threatened the ideal of the public health model that was making the important new drugs available to everyone who needed them. An especially influential political actor at this time was the American Senator Estes Kefauver. Disturbed by the growing power of the pharmaceutical industry, he oversaw 10 years of hearings, and I'm sorry that type is kind of small, but maybe you could read it. So he was disturbed by the growing power of the industry, and he oversaw 10 years of hearings into the industry's practices in the United States. The result was the 1962 Kefauver-Harris amendments to the Food and Drug and Cosmetics Act, which tightened drug safety regulations and required drug companies to provide evidence of efficacy and safety as a prerequisite to drug approvals. The act also allowed the government to regulate drug advertising and expose the techniques the industry used to keep drug prices high. Senator Kefauver failed to get controls on drug prices in the United States, but other countries succeeded. And they also put similar systems in place to regulate drug safety and effectiveness. So moving to the nonprofit or the non-governmental organization world, in this period, the post-war period, grassroots groups flourished in this welfare state era, and they supported strong drug regulations. In Canada, the federal and provincial governments funded civil society groups as a form of post-war nation building and citizenship. Policymakers valued groups that brought forward issues based on community concerns that they felt could improve the public health policy. Groups that were interested in public health, in consumer protection, in women's health, and in international development joined forces to become a strong pro-regulatory force in drug policy. Locally based organizations formed national and international networks, creating a movement that was a countervailing force to powerful industry interests in the marketplace. Here in Europe, Health Action International was set up in 1981 as a watchdog group to monitor the pharmaceutical industry on behalf of consumers. Health Action International pressed the World Health Organization for a code on the unethical marketing of pharmaceuticals and to ensure access to essential medicines in countries where it was lacking. But not everyone agreed that this was a golden age, and these progressive trends met resistance. The American economist and historian Edward Nika has documented this development in the development of what he calls neoliberal pharmaceutical science. Here in Europe, conservative economists who saw the ascendancy of the state as a threat to freedom formed the Mont Pelerin Society in 1948 to promote a free market economy. Their anti-regulatory messages resonated with American free market economists at the University of Chicago and with the pharmaceutical executives in the United States who strongly opposed the Kefauver-Harris Amendment. In 1972, the conservative American economists met with the pharmaceutical industry executives to discuss strategies that would create a market-friendly, deregulated pharmaceutical industry. Far from serving the public interest, conference members agreed the Kefauver-Harris amendments were keeping valuable, potentially useful drugs from the market. The health of consumers, they reasoned, would be best served by making drugs available quickly and by giving the industry responsibility for educating the public about drugs. A key to their strategy was to attack the clinical trial system of providing scientific evidence on drug safety and efficacy. They constructed an alternative discourse that depicted the US FDA as a Soviet-style thought police that undermined the freedom of patients to make their own decisions. Two key figures creating this strategy were Louis Lasagna, a physician and clinical pharmacologist, and Sam Peltzman, an economist. Lasagna had been a fierce proponent of clinical trials, but later decided that medicine was inherently too uncertain and value-laden for science to yield definitive answers. Lasagna argued that performance in the marketplace was the best way to judge the effectiveness of drugs. Rather than relying on the imperfect tool of clinical trials, he proposed turning decisions over to patients who could make drug decisions based on their own values. Peltzman argued that added an economic rationale for abandoning the clinical trial system. He said the Kefauver amendments of 1962 had reduced demand for consumer demand for drugs, and this, he argued, had decreased consumer welfare. He reasoned that the public would gain by trading the risks of accelerated drug promotion for its benefits. By his reasoning, the cost of drug regulation far exceeded the costs of having a thalidomide tragedy. Indeed, he said, we don't have enough thalidomide tragedies in the United States today. In 1976, this same group hired Lasagna to set up the Center for the Study of Drug Development at Tufts University. This is in I think it's in Pennsylvania, but it's in the eastern United States. The center would conduct research on pharmaceuticals in concert with pharmaceutical companies with industry funding. Research data would be kept confidential. Strategic projects included generating arguments for use in policy debates, which gave birth to two enduring ideas: drug lag and the $800 million pill. Drug lag was the claim that patients were being denied access to drugs because of bureaucratic inertia. The $800 million pill was a discourse that claimed drugs are so expensive to develop that price controls would put a stop to new drug development. To reinforce such ideas, Lasagna set up think tanks of like-minded scholars in different countries. In Canada, the best known is the Fraser Institute. Adopting the echo chamber strategy that the tobacco industry used so successfully, these think tanks issued reports with similar arguments and produced journal articles repeating the same claims. So based on my research, I conclude that these efforts to instill an anti-regulatory discourse in the public have been remarkably successful, and that patient groups have contributed significantly to their success. As a case study, I looked in detail at the breast cancer groups in Canada, which provide an extreme example of a shift that occurred internationally. The Canadian policy tradition that had valued citizen engagement as a core part of the Canadian welfare state ended abruptly in neoliberal Canada. Political discourse redefined social justice advocacy as the work of special interest groups, and new economic policies withdrew the government support of these groups. Barbara Mincies, who's now an epidemiologist specializing in pharmaceutical policy, began her career working in a women's health center in Vancouver. When I interviewed her for my research, she recalled the group being 100% funded by the provincial government, and then we moved in a day to zero funding. So Canada's breast cancer movement evolved on the cusp of this dramatic transition. Around 1980, women began to form small, locally based patient breast cancer groups. And they began to speak in the media about their profound dissatisfaction with the status quo, the lack of information on which to make treatment decisions, inadequate emotional supports, paternalistic physicians, and a dearth of understanding about how to prevent the disease. When I read articles by Paolo Mosconi here at the Institute on the needs of women in the Italian breast cancer groups in the late 1990s, I found the parallels quite striking. Italian women's concerns covered a very broad range, from prevention to psychological problems. The central focus was not on gaining access to drugs. In one survey, Dr. Mosconi analyzed over 4,000 requests made to 41 breast cancer groups, 41 Italian breast cancer centers, and only 2.1% of the requests had to do with new drugs and therapies. In Canada, too, new drugs were only part of the early concerns of patient groups. But as governments withdrew their support of grassroots advocacy, the pharmaceutical companies began to approach the groups with offers of support. During the decade of the 1990s, when the movement was growing rapidly, patient advocacy groups began to rely on the pharmaceutical industry for funding. And as they formed these partnerships, the groups that I studied accepted and sometimes promoted both the discourse of drug lag and the $800 million pill. And in doing so, they became part of the echo chamber that was created by the Center for the Study of Drug Development. Now, nothing in my conversations with activists suggested that they were aware of the deep roots of their rhetoric in Lasagna's grand vision of a pharmaceutical policy based not on science, but on markets. Yet, an understanding behind the industry funding of the groups was that the industry would educate the patients about drugs. And the discourse about drugs within the groups corresponds closely to those of neoliberal pharmaceutical science. In my research, I document conferences, webinars, articles, and books that discuss the industry's goals in working with groups and strategies for achieving the goals. They make the claim that patients want and will benefit from timely access to the most appropriate treatment and care, and that groups working with industry can create appropriate information and educational materials. Over the next 15 years, the groups that I studied began to focus much of their advocacy on gaining access to the expensive new drugs that were coming on the market for breast cancer: Taxol, Herceptin, aromatase inhibitors, and more recently, drugs to treat metastatic breast cancer. Now, I don't claim that the advocacy for treatments is solely due to funding from the industry, but drug access is a recurring theme in the projects that drug companies fund. Even the campaigns that don't appear to be about promoting drugs often are. And I'll highlight two examples that I discuss in my book. One's a campaign to raise awareness of chemo-induced anemia and fatigue, and the other is a patient's Bill of Rights. So the Anemia Awareness Campaign was a classic disease awareness campaign that came about through a partnership between the Canadian Breast Cancer Network and OrthoBiotech, a subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson. In 1999, the organization faced a gradual phase-out of government support. That same year, OrthoBiotech invited the Canadian Breast Cancer Network to enter into a partnership. After an initial year of generous funding and expensive meals for the group's executive, the company offered a 3-year contract for about $100,000 a year, but this time with conditions. The company was marketing the expensive drug erythropoietin, brand name Eprex, to combat anemia in breast cancer patients. The contract specified that the group would raise awareness about the risks of anemia and fatigue for cancer patients through workshops and newsletters and other projects such as Anemia Month. Some members of the board, including the group's president, objected. She said, "We might as well put up a big sign saying we're promoting Eprex." But the majority argued that the group needed the money, and the group signed a 3-year contract, including most of the disputed terms. 3 board members resigned, and the story ended badly for patients. Between 2002 and 2006, evidence accumulated that EPREX hastens the death of cancer patients by causing thromboembolic events and by promoting the growth of cancers. In other cases I analyzed, the companies took a more subtle approach, and the projects don't seem related to drug promotion. But I argue that they were. And one example is the project to promote patients' rights. Between 2003 and 2006, the company AstraZeneca funded an initiative to create a Canadian breast cancer patients' bill or charter of rights. The project was funded through and spearheaded by a group called Willow, which was dedicated to providing breast cancer patients with unbiased information and about treatments and other issues. This particular group brought women from breast cancer groups across the country together for what was billed as an advocacy workshop. To begin, the women were asked to brainstorm about the care, access to treatment, and support in their home provinces. And inevitably, there were regional disparities. On the second day, after being treated to a lavish dinner and gift baskets, courtesy of AstraZeneca, participants were told the goal of the program was to create a patient bill of rights, which would become a lobbying tool to address regional disparities that they had identified in their brainstorming session. So I interviewed one participant, Kathleen, who said she was upset the participants weren't told that the purpose of the workshop was already predetermined and was to be a patient's bill of rights. She said, I think it's a complicated issue. All these young women who are the PR staff for AstraZeneca showed me a great time, but really is a drug company trying to get us to advocate, to tell women that they're entitled to get whatever drugs they want or need, no matter how expensive it is? Is it going to bankrupt our healthcare system? And I suspect Kathleen's hunch was correct. Many jurisdictions have introduced patients' rights documents. They vary widely in content and force. The majority are voluntary guidelines that assert moral rights, like the right to participate in decisions affecting care and the right to dignity. Documents that assert entitlements to goods and services, such as particular medical tests or treatments, are less common. When included, such rights are usually tied to structural and economic constraints. And indeed, Canadian law states that provinces are not required to provide services beyond the provincial government's budgetary means. But an initial draft of the document that was created in the months after the workshop included a statement that asserted patients have the right to the highest standard of care regardless of cost. 2 AstraZeneca breast cancer drugs were named as examples. The document underwent much discussion among patient representatives, and the final version included only moral rights. The company mysteriously and abruptly withdrew from the project before the women had developed a distribution plan for their finalized document. Now, the Canadian project was actually inspired by the decade-long effort to create a European Bill of Rights for cancer patients. The executive director of Willow had met a member of the breast cancer group Europe-Adana at a conference, and this led to the Canadian initiative. I don't know the whole story of the European document or whether it's been finalized, but an article that was published in 2014 describes a Bill of Rights that would underpin equitable access to an optimal standard of care for European citizens. Funding from Sanofi Oncology, Bayer, and Bristol Myers Squibb Foundation is acknowledged, and the article asserts that the European patient should have rapid access to the latest innovations in diagnosis and treatment following the relevant regulatory approval. While these are entitlements, I interpreted the document to be aspirational rather than legally binding. Nonetheless, with cancer drug prices spiraling out of control, a document funded by pharmaceutical interests that asserts a patient's rights to rapid access to the latest innovations in treatment makes me uneasy. Funding given to the patient groups I studied was always given as an unconditional educational grant, which the group's leaders interpreted to mean that they were strings-free. But on close examination, I found that the projects always had a potential benefit for the sponsoring company, one that was seldom obvious to group members or to the public. So these projects in Canada reflect what I argue is a global agenda on the part of the pharmaceutical industry to engage with patients and patient groups to promote the goal of drug deregulation. As Edward Nicka explains, the goal of Lasagna and his Chicago School colleagues wasn't just to remove power over drug regulation from regulators and scientists, but it was to return power to the people, and thus to the market, where patient demand would determine drug use and prices. But is patient choice really the gold ring that the advocacy movement has made it out to be? So this brings me to the work of Anne-Marie Moll. Louis Lasagna's claim that medicine is inherently uncertain has merit. Medical research rarely yields a one-size-fits-all remedy, even for patients with virtually identical diagnoses. For Lasagna, the answer to this uncertainty was to let the market decide, give patients the freedom to choose the treatment they want, and see what happens. So Moll takes a different tack. Based on field research in which she studied type 1 diabetics during their consultations with caregivers, she refutes the premise that sick patients are autonomous individuals who want choice above all, or that they are even in a position to make these choices, make choices that will improve their health. In rejecting the logic of choice, Moll argues that patients are vulnerable and that their desires for health are unlimited. A logic of patient choice opens the door to unlimited commercial exploitation. Advertisements that hold out impossible images of perfect health therefore don't confer power, she reasons. Rather, they exploit the patient's understandable desire to get well. Moll proposes a different model, which she calls the logic of care. She says, care is what patients want above all. They want help in understanding what's possible and how to achieve it. She stresses that this decision is never final. It can be modified as a particular patient's response to a given treatment becomes evident, and as that patient's condition changes over time. She recognizes that patients today reject the paternalism in which the physician alone navigates medicine's uncertainty, and she rejects it too. Instead, she proposes an interactive process in which patients and care professionals share treatment decisions with full knowledge on both sides of the risks and benefits. The pharmaceutical industry funds initiatives that support a logic of choice. Pharmaceutical funded projects tend to converge on one goal, encouraging rapid approvals of expensive new drug treatments and ensuring that they're funded through the public purse. But recall the wide range of inadequately met needs that breast cancer patients described when their voices were first being heard in the 1990s. Patients need more than drugs. They need a comprehensive functioning system and help navigating their illnesses. When groups express pressure to rush new expensive drugs to market and to have them put on publicly funded drug formularies before they've been adequately tested, the very systems on which patients depend for this comprehensive care are held to ransom. So in conclusion, I would say that the promise of patient activism the threefold promise of patient activism to add value to science, to create a more just and democratic system, and to better align research and care with patient needs is, in my fear is that we haven't done any of these, and in fact, we've undermined the rationale on which patient advocacy is based. Now, I began with the example of the patients' rights organization that argued for Dibella's quack treatment for cancer, because I believe the parallels with today's patient advocacy movement are striking. Of course, the drug treatments at issue are in this type of advocacy are not quack treatments, but the method of using patient organizations to uncritically promote access to them is the same. We need to envision a different system of patient engagement. First and foremost, I believe we need to develop a system of funding patient groups that gives them complete independence from the pharmaceutical industry. A number of models have been proposed, but not enacted. And a few European countries still provide groups with government funds. Research shows that many organizations would rather not take industry money, but they see no alternative. Groups understand that they will lose credibility if they're perceived as being in the industry's pocket. And this is why so many groups resist pressures to be transparent about their funding. Second, I argue that we need to challenge the myths of neoliberal pharmaceutical science. The health policy literature includes a mountain of evidence that challenges ideas like drug lag and the $800 million pill. But this evidence isn't part of the public discourse. We did manage to combat the echo chamber of false claims about tobacco. We can do it for drugs as well. The appeal of a magic pill is seductive, but people do understand the value of a healthcare system that delivers comprehensive patient care. And third, I think we need to expand and strengthen our international networks of health research and advocacy based on a public health model. We don't need more thalidomide tragedies. We need more institutes like the Mario Negri.
Thank you, Sharon, for your presentation. Does anyone have comments or questions?
Thank you very much for this presentation. I think that, as you said, unfortunately, it's very difficult to get funds for these initiatives. What do you think about the possibility to have a basket of money in which company put the money, so the different companies, but are not really associating any project, so that this might be more acceptable to me, at least the possibility to have some sort of sort of money available for the patients movement that is not really related to to single drugs, to single projects.
I absolutely think that's a good idea, but that idea has been around now for 20, 30 years, and I don't know if the drug companies would do that. I mean, I think it would be great if they did. You could also have a basket where some government money would go into it and have it all independently, have some kind of a body that would decide on how to disperse the money. I don't know how you would make that appealing to industry. There's also this kind of denial that industry is actually, steering the groups. Very similar to what goes on with physicians. I make that parallel that, physicians who are receiving industry money typically say, well, this doesn't influence them. There's also a system that I found intriguing in Germany where they put a tax on every, a small surcharge on every drug sale to a patient, and that goes into a pot and is dispersed to patient groups. I think there are a number of ways it could be looked at, and alternatives could be developed. But I don't see industry or government or even patient groups demanding that kind of a shift. I don't know if other people have ideas on how the groups could be independently funded. Any other questions or suggestions or thoughts?
I was wondering how is the awareness of the possible risk of being funded by pharmaceutical companies among the groups that you have reached in your research? Because the first thing is, are they aware about what they are bringing into the discussion? I mean, probably they are not bringing the patient's voice, but some other voices.
Well, the groups, people that I talk to, you know, as I said, with similar to physicians who accept funding from drug companies, they tend to say, you know, we're not influenced, we're smart people, we're ethical people, we have, you know, there are a number of voluntary contracts that have been developed that are fairly standard now, where the patient groups will say, well, we only take money from multiple companies, so we don't do the sort of thing that happened with orthobiotech, where it's one company giving them the money. But I don't see that as solving the problem, because all the companies want to have their drugs approved quickly, and they all want to have, you know, high prices. So I don't see how it makes a difference to say that you're taking money from multiple companies. But these are the kinds of workarounds that have been developed. I think the groups are very aware that they could lose the confidence of the public if it's suggested that they're in the pockets of the industry. And so their tendency is to deny that they're in the pockets of the industry, even though they're taking industry money. Some of the groups that I've talked to say, yes, absolutely, they would like another source of funding, but there is no source, at least in Canada and in most other countries. Well, it varies a lot. You know, the countries I've looked at in Europe, there are some that do have government funding, but it's quite competitive to get it, or it's maybe not enough for all the expectations that we've put on the groups. I mean, it really, the whole idea of patient engagement has put tremendous pressure on these groups to provide, you know, people who will be engaged in consultations and so on. And that does take a fair bit of time and energy and preparation. So I think that the issue is just, you know, it's a kind of a hot potato that none of the invested interests really have grappled with it. I mean, I think there's beginning to be pressure to do so. I mean, I had mentioned to you prior to the talk that in Canada there was a front page story the other day about a patient group that was receiving money from a company that was making a particularly expensive drug. Now a biosimilar has come on the market that's half the price. The group was telling their members there is also a biosimilar, and the drug company withdrew their funding from the group. And so it's caused a crisis, and it has drawn attention to this whole dilemma. But that's one of the first major stories that has come out in Canada. I think generally the public, when I speak to people who aren't, you know, following these kinds of issues, that they're shocked when they hear that the groups get money from drug companies. They don't know.
Just to say that, as you said, you have a cover on a newspaper, so it is also a matter of culture. So maybe, as we said before, we were talking a few minutes before, the thing is not only the funding from pharmaceutical industry, is of the system that take you in at the table with other relationships with research groups, from scientific society, and pharmaceutical industry. So I think it's also a question of power. You bring the patient group within a relationship and my question was just you deal with the logic of choice. So you say patient decide in autonomy which treatment is best, and the pharmaceutical industry use this kind of value. I would say if you draw a line between the logic of choice and the logic of care, or if you think that the logic of choice is always a negative things that can be used by pharmaceutical industry to.
Well, I mean, to me, it suggests that drugs are then part of the market economy as opposed to a particular kind of product that, first of all, is part of the common welfare and, to be used judiciously, and also that there can be tremendous harm in using a drug if it's used inappropriately. So I don't say that patients shouldn't have any say, but I think that we have allowed this idea that the drug companies are the ones that understand the drugs the best, and so they're the logical go-to for educating the patients. And yet I don't think that they're necessarily going to be as open as they should be. If you're really going to educate patients, you want to educate them about negative side effects. You want to educate them about non-drug treatments. So I think that's the danger in looking at drugs as an ordinary commodity where you just go in and buy a pair of shoes and you choose the ones you like. And the assumption that patients have some special understanding of drugs that are so new that we really don't know enough about them, even for physicians to know whether the drug is going to work or not. I think that's, I see it as a pretty a clear distinction, or a distinction that's very important to at least talk about. Do you think that I'm making it too black and white?
No. I was making it black and white, but I was struggling with these divisions.
Yeah.
No, thank you. Any question from Bergamo?
I wonder if there's any, any parallels or differences that you see in the phenomenon, the similar phenomenon in Italy, whether it seems similar to what I've described in Canada or whether you see it as being somewhat different. Does anybody have any thoughts about that?
I think it's quite... The role of patient groups, I think it's quite similar. I just have one doubt about the things you say that some groups are starting thinking that not taking funding from pharmaceutical industry can make a difference. I think in Italy, I don't know, or the broad picture, because it's very variable, but some groups are deciding to accept money from pharmaceutical industry because they have no other funding, and they say all the people at the table receive funding from pharmaceutical industry, so why? I think that it's quite difficult to find some patient groups that decide not to take fund from pharmaceutical industry that become a speaker a stakeholder, when politician or other setting decide who to involve in the debate or in the patient engagement initiatives.
I think that perhaps our situation is a bit worse because I think that at least in the States, in Canada, I guess there are more governmental initiatives, for example, to organize big clinical trials or something like that. That is, here is most of the big clinical trials in oncology are run through the funds of industries. Now, this means that the oncologists are really highly connected with industries, and they transmit to the patients. Sometimes they really, the idea to ask money to a big company starts from the oncologist that suggests to the patients, why don't you ask this company to the other, because now they are developing drugs in these specific tumors and so on. So, of course, the patient trust the doctor, trust the physician, and so I mean the patient's ability to criticize the system is zero essentially, because he's in a position to really trust what the oncologist tells him and or her. So I think this is, and I think in our countries there are very few. I don't know. I don't think there are charities or governmental support to this kind of. I'm right. I don't know, Paola, if you want to comment on this.
Yeah, I agree with Maurizio. The problem for the consumer or breast cancer group is the system, the system around. Why a patient, from the point of view of patient group, why I can refuse money or support from the pharmaceutical company when the scientific medical group accept is a system that is in some way that must be changed in some way, if it's possible at this point when we are now. And from the point of view of patient group in Italy, it's very, very difficult to find independent funds and so on. And in particular also for the small group, because maybe for breast cancer or illness with the
arthritis
number,
or something,
yes,
diabetes.
maybe a public money is easier, but for the small group is very, very difficult. And so the company, pharmaceutical or not, are the only way. And also in this situation it's difficult also to discuss with the groups do less and do independently. No, they want to do more. Why don't organize a small or big congress in a big hotel with the lunch and so on, and with the pharmaceutical company? Why not? So they want to do more, and they are not able to say, no, I do less independent than more not independent. Then also a lot of consumer groups think that they are able to manage possible conflict of interest. If you ask, they say, I take money, but then I decide what to do. This is not the truth.
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate that we've allowed that model to become so ingrained that it's considered normal, and that that other sources have kind of faded away. And yeah, in Canada there are a few groups that remain independent, but they really don't have enough money to be that active. Yeah.
Probably the problem is nothing is changed since Luis Lasagna everywhere. The problem is probably comparing different situations, different systems. So there is different from one country to another. Take into account is public or not the approach. UK, Italy, Canada in part, and so. But also in this case, the cultural level is low. Take into account the health. And the confidence in the system are not so high. And this is probably the core of the problem. So take into account why we have to. The problem is a market problem. So, and it is worldwide. So it's not. In particular, we try to think and to talk concerning the drug, but the problem is not only for the pharmaceutical drug. Concerning everything. And so the economic aspect also you underline, so or your third part, or your third part concerning the confidence, so this to do again very well. And so also the rule of the different actors also is to better underline, also take into account the role of doctor as point between the needs of the patients and the need of the system, because this is another problem. So it's I think, complex also to think and to do something of best or for the better for the patients also in this case. Also, in the role of the patient is important to identify. It's different because it's not enough to do the participation or underline the participation, but it's enough for what, in which is the contribution by the patient, which is the contribution real by each doctor and so on. In other cases, we have only to discuss, okay, we can do, but with a small to do.
Yeah, I think the whole concept of patient engagement is so fuzzy. It's really, it has lost a lot of its meaning. It's just become a buzzword. We've had a bit of a, well, I've been working with CADIS, our drug assessment agency in Canada, trying to get them to realize that they need to provide sources of funding if they want to engage patients in their annual meeting. And I think they really didn't understand the extent to which there were patient organizations out there who wanted to engage but didn't have the funding, and that they were relying on these groups that were funded by pharma. I think there's now been an awareness within that organization. So I think if you can build an awareness within really key organizations, that could start to develop a pressure for some change. Maybe I'm being optimistic. I have to be optimistic.
Thank you, Sharon.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for coming.